All right, welcome to another episode of New Wine Uncorked. And as always, I'm stoked to be here alongside my two dudes, Tony and Phil. And again, I feel like every time we come to a recording and we sit down to do this, I look back and I ponder, wow, what a week. And it was just a week. And it's crazy how heavy and full these days seem to be lately. And if anyone who's watching has been around at all, the truth of new wine is to build relational bridges. And it's because of this dude named Jesus, who some 2,000 years ago stepped down from heaven. Jesus, the Son of God, steps down into heaven, into creation, so as to build these bridges, these relational bridges. And today we see, I'm not quite sure, we were talking about this earlier before we started recording, but whether or not there's more of a fracturing in today's relational structure and relational truth of who we are, or is it just being like amplified because of social media? And I bring to mind, for those of you that don't know, each one of us is on Instagram, and Tony just posted this, and I talked to Tony about it and wanted to, because his post on Instagram, I think, is just, it brings to mind, plus it's a beautiful picture of he and his, it was a picture of you and your mom, right, Tony? And so on it, he says, Vision said, well, and is talking about the WandaVision, and Tony was using the quotation that says, what is grief but love persevering? And so, Tony, when you brought that up, like, first of all, give me just your mindset behind that, because you posted it with your mom, you posted in light of her being vaccinated, but also, and the next post that you had was a post going out to all the women within your community, and just a deep sense of care. So what was it behind, last week we talked about the church, is it building relationships, or is it participating in building chaos? And this week we want to talk about the church. Are we so boxed in as the church that we don't even see the suffering outside of our own specific people group? Or is the church available to see this? So when you're writing that, Tony, what were some of the thoughts that you were thinking when you're posting that and that line? Tell me a little bit about that line.
Yeah, so for the last, I would say, month to two, our uncorked conversations have centered around do we have the capacity to suffer together? And what does it mean for suffering to be a authentic mark of the Christian life, stemming from um, Dr. Metzger's um, personal life right now and what he's going through with his family, to our ongoing conversation, to what our Black African American brothers and sisters live on a daily basis. And then, as of this week, the murder of 8 people, 6 being Asian women in Atlanta, Georgia, and then the attack on an Asian grandma in San Francisco. It really stirred in me just this. It's not a new sense or a new awareness, but I think at times when you carry something heavy, you build up the muscle to carry it, and then it no longer becomes heavy and you're not aware of it. You build immunity, you build a strength, the like. And so I think living in our particular day and age, living in our particular culture, living in our society, um, it's heavy carrying the awareness of uh, the the aggression against communities of color. But eventually, after carrying it for a certain time, you are numb to it, or you aren't as, it's not as prevalent at the forefront of your mind. But recently, because of the attacks, that awareness is once again brought to the surface. Not because it's been dormant, but because it's there to remind you that once again, you are not safe, or the people you care about and love aren't safe. And uh, personally, the over 2020 and over the last year of dealing with COVID, it's been tremendously anxiety inducing for me, because my mom is 70, 71. and she's fiercely independent and fiercely dogmatic about defending her independence. And so she's not looking for my help. She's not looking for handouts. She's not looking for um, uh, domestic assistance. She wants to live her life the way she lives her life. And so there's always a nagging worry about, man, is she going to get COVID? Is she going to fall ill? And so all of my tension and anxiety was somewhat relieved when she was able to get vaccinated, because it's like, man, we're able to take the first step towards having her of regaining some sort of control and giving her back some sort of normalcy. But then on the day she gets vaccinated, yeah, the news comes out of this mass shooting of uh, Asian women who were targeted, and there happened to be non-Asian people who were caught as casualties in that direct racial attack. And it was so sombering, and it hit me because it's like, man, I spent this whole year trying to protect my mom from COVID, and it's so startling once again to realize, man, there's just nothing. And I think, yeah, watching WandaVision with my girlfriend, that the line that one of the main characters says to the other main character in her grief is, what is grief but love persevering? And as a pastor, as a preacher, I always grab a hold of those money lines, because those can be gifts, those can be prophetic words. And it was just, yeah, it's so true. What is grief but love persevering? Um, but then in reflection on how my mom and my sisters and my aunties and the women of the Asian community and women of communities of color continue to be unsafe, the line that arose in my heart and my spirit was, what is fear but grief anticipated? What is fear but grief anticipated? Because the fear is that the women and the elderly of our communities, the most vulnerable, at times will continue to be attacked. And that's the fear. It's not the fear of white supremacy or racism or misogyny or patriarchy, but it's an anticipation of grieving the loss of their safety, the loss of their independence, the loss of their purity because of the violence enacted upon them and the like. And so that's just overarching the framework or the state of my soul the past 72 hours is yeah, how do I stay present for the people that I love, and continue the work that we need to continually do. So yeah.
Isn't it? I mean, Phil, over these last couple of weeks, I got to believe that the attacks within and against the Asian community, I would imagine that anyone who's been under attack, especially within the community of color, that this just is another. And I don't know if sometimes the response is, well, and unfortunately, for the Black community, gosh, it's got to be like a weird and tragic, this is our life, and so like I feel the pain of Tony, and I wonder when Tony's experiencing this is maybe, and I don't want to put anything in your into your words, Tony, but like you're stepping into this level of care because of the grief that hasn't been experienced. Like you said, you thought that there was this protection for what you thought was the biggest against your mom, and then all of a sudden when you get that protection taken care of, now all of a sudden, oh wait, she's still under attack. And I'm wondering, Phil, like as you're watching this play out and things, what is it that the church can do though? Because Tony's exactly right. Like we need to continue to press in, but gosh, when you see attacks coming against the most vulnerable, I mean, what is it that as a human are we supposed to do? How can we look up to this guy and say, yes, this is a God of love, when I turn to the streets and seeing, you know, men, predominantly men, you know, in our age group, going out and beating up, you know, and like Tony's thing, your post was beautiful, Tony. You weren't calling out like, hey, this is against this person or against this person. Exactly what Dr. King said back in the 60s. Our fight isn't against the white supremacists or white people. It's against racism. It's against this oppressiveness. Exactly what your shirt's saying, Phil. Injustice anywhere is injustice everywhere. How do we continue to press into this to where it doesn't become then more of a segregation competing between our people groups where, oh, hey, I'm more oppressed than you, so hey, you, and we don't want to have a response of, well, welcome to our world, right? Even though that might be the reality that maybe folks are thinking like, hey, we've been beaten up. How do we though use this not as something to exploit, because but it's a reality. How do we embrace this to where it's not condescending? It's not that hero mentality of, like Tony's saying, he ends it by saying, I know the women of our Asian community don't need our saving. They're strongest. For I'm sure in your community too, Phil, you felt that strength of your women. How is it that we embrace this so it's not a condescending or arrogance from anyone outside of the Asian community, but to step in just the same as when the Black community comes under attack and has been under attack? How do we embrace this to be in connection with each other and cooperation, and not where someone like me is trying to step in and fix it? You know, the white culture can't step in and fix this, because a lot of times the white culture is creating this. And when we try to fix it, we're trying to fix it in our way. So what's the way to embrace this? Like, how do we step into this in a Christ-like, spirit-led manner? Truth, reality.
Yeah, a couple of thoughts come to mind. First, right off the bat, thanks for everything you shared, Tony. Yeah, looking at the Facebook post and the Instagram post and just what you shared here today. Thank you. So just one of the first things I have is that I consistently say is being honest about your feelings when things like this happen. When I first heard this happen on Tuesday night, my first thought was just, whoa, again? Wait, am I hearing what I thought I heard? That kind of thing. And then I kind of just felt like a weird sense of vulnerability for a minute personally, where I was like, whoa, this can really just happen like anywhere. And at the same token, thinking of the Asian sisters that I have that are out there, just wondering how they felt, how they are feeling and the like. And again, scrolling through Instagram and Facebook to capture some of those thoughts. And yeah, just kind of the sense of hopelessness kind of just said, okay. But then in light of what we had going on last summer and, things behind COVID, I was anticipating, I don't know what I was anticipating. But then when I heard the police chief or sheriff and the like share his thoughts on, yeah, that's what I got mad when he connected it to sex addiction and connected it to, what was one of the quotes? He was having a bad day.
Mm-hmm.
That's when I got mad and was like, whoa, I mean, like, after all of this, we should not be able to put people on TV or in front of any microphone to say things like that. And just, yeah, that part made me angry.
Yeah.
Yeah, that after that part, I wasn't sad anymore. It was full on just, yo, okay, that person needs to be fired. This person needs to be thrown under the jail. And yeah, let's punish this piece of it. But the notion of competing grief, that's not something that we should be feeling right now. This is traumatic for any of us, because the reality that someone can go into a building and start shooting is possible at any day. They could target any one of us for any reason that they choose to, because this is what they're going to do. And we hope that our legal system punishes them. But the fact that, yeah, we're all vulnerable to this kind of stuff is a reality. And that is scary when I think of my wife, my daughters, when I think of my Asian sisters that are out here, and just knowing that when I think of Tony's mom, just that there's just so much vulnerability in light of this, and we have to really be just aware of our surroundings when we're in places and just those kind of things, because man, this kind of stuff can happen, and these are the people that we need to protect right off the bat. So
Yeah, I think, and it bums me out. I mean, it doesn't bum me out. It totally pisses me off, especially too when I hear the comments like you were saying, Phil, and what you mentioned, Tony, about this just being a bad day. And it might be, let's say that it's a sexual addiction and this guy, has an issue. And wherever in Atlanta, the massage parlors, if they are, the owners are Asian, but it's such a shallow and insensitive comment to say that it's just purely about a sexual addiction. I mean, or that it's a bad day. And gosh, when I heard that, I read it, and my first thought, this is I was, because grandmothers, for a lot of us, my grandmother died when I was in my 20s, and I have, thankfully, of our 4 grandmothers between my wife and I, 2 of them are still alive, and there's a preciousness there, and so that really did grip me. And then it bummed me out when I looked, and I have to be honest, in the back of my mind, when I just read the comment, I can't believe a crime against senior citizens. I don't understand that. To me, it's like kicking a baby. It makes me almost want to throw up. It makes me sick in my stomach. And then my next thought was, gosh, I sure hope that this dude isn't white. And when I saw that, because it seems like there's an insensitiveness, I don't know what it is, other than saying, and I don't want to be an extremist, just like in your post, Tony, you kept saying, you're not trying to be an extremist, but when you say what is true right there in front of you, it's not extremism, it's reality. And this continues to be a constant theme, I think, in white older men, is this inability or unwillingness to see what is directly in front of us. I mean, this is beyond just a sex addiction. Okay, I'm sorry, but this dude was able to dehumanize people. And in the comments that the chief was saying, he was doing the exact same thing, was dehumanizing the victims. And I feel like that's a lot of times the response that we have. There's no care. And where's the church? I'm hoping that the church in the Atlanta area is coming around these families. But so often I see that there's just more judgment. My concern is that the response for anyone watching this, because of our political tensions, that when it comes to sex, around something that seems to be sexual, because all people have to do, because we live in such a heightened, politically incorrect, all people have to do is start throwing around the generalized innuendos about people groups, and they start to see a massage parlor that has anything to do with Asian, then automatically is something dealing with sex. And so that they don't even deal with what I believe is the primary issue. This is clearly an ethnic, one race going against another. And it seems like that's the case with the police brutality. And yet for some reason, I feel like the church people, who are supposed to be rooted in truth, we are the ones that are the last to the table in calling out what we see in front of us. Why is the truth? I mean, so it's not deceptive. And yet we within the church seem to make the truth so deceptive, because it's not the church people who can call it out and say, this clearly is an inhumane act. Let's say people within the church don't even want to use the R word. Okay. Can't they just say that this is the problem with the dehumanizing aspects that we have in today's culture, whether it's around masks or vaccines or anything? We're not willing to deal with it. The NPR just put out a report about vaccinations. Well, where are the vaccinations the lowest? In the minority communities, in the communities of color. Because why? There's a lack of distrust by the communities of color because of this, kind of way we treat when communities of color come under attack. We almost make it like it's your fault. We, meaning the white majority group. but how do we break through that mentality? Like, how do we break that down so that people understand what you're talking about, Tony? They don't see a dude sitting there pissing and moaning about the system or about people. They see a dude who is deeply rooted in the love of Christ and cares about his mom, his sister, but cares about the whole community. How do we get that mindset to break free into the church so that when I see this, my first thought is not, I hope it is not white, but oh my gosh, another attack on me, our people, us, injustice anywhere is injustice everywhere. How do we get that to where people feel the pain and the suffering and want to feel it that you're talking about, Tony?
Yeah, Matt, I appreciate your sensitivity in talking about the sexualization of Asian women. But I think in order for us to do the work, we need to shoot it straight. And what we're seeing is that white people and people in proximity to whiteness would far rather believe somebody who has committed mass murder than they would minorities and victims of white supremacy. So when the mass shooter says, "Oh, this wasn't racism. I did this because I have sexual addiction," white people and people in proximity to whiteness would far rather take him at his word because there's a value on what a white man says over when people of color and women of color are saying, no, this has a long history of the sexualization of women of color prompting violence. Like, this is clearly an act of racial violence. And the complexity we need to sit in is that racism and sexual violence intersect and collide. They aren't divorced. And so it's not that we have to say, okay, was this a sexual attack or a racial attack? No, because they're Asian women, this is clearly both and.
Mm.
What we're seeing is the culmination of centuries of fetishization and objectification of Asian women and the Asian body. What we're seeing is and the most heinous things, the most bastardy things I've seen is when pastors have been saying, well, those Korean women would not have been killed if they weren't prostitutes. And to have pastors say that leads me to see that there are contending Christianities. What we see from the killer, from the mass shooter, is that he comes from a Southern Baptist church. And within the Southern Baptist church, we see this long tradition of speaking out against what they would consider sexual immorality. But what we also see is the former president of the Southern Baptists, or the chair of their executive committee, be very cozy with Ravi Zacharias, who is now known to have been a sexual predator and a sexual trafficker. And you see the intersection. So this young man who has committed a sexual racial hate crime and committed mass murder, who was groomed and discipled within a Southern Baptist church, and we see the direct link to a head leader within the Southern Baptist church who is close to a sexual predator. We see it all there, and this isn't a conspiracy; it's there. It's damning evidence. And what we need to see is this even further. I have so many people who I am either friends with or acquaintances with who are white men with Asian wives, who say, this wasn't a hate crime because I have an Asian wife, or my family member is Asian. And what is a lie straight from the pit of hell is that they believe proximity to their whiteness provides safety. That because you are in my circumference of my privilege, even though they wouldn't say that, that's what they're communicating in essence, maybe not in words. you have nothing to worry about. And then to take this even a step further, whenever we say, well, is this the same as Black Lives Matter? Like, is the hate and the violence being acted against the Asian community, is that the same as Black Lives Matter? What we're doing is reinforcing anti-Blackness from a larger majority culture, majority society into the Asian community. And what we need to realize is the Klan comes for everybody. The wizard comes for everybody. And so this idea of, is this the same as Black Lives Matter? Who cares? What matters is, until Black Lives Matter, Asian hate will not stop. And until Asian hate stops, we need to continually say Black Lives Matter. It's all intersected. It's not that complicated. And even for the Asian community needs to have a reckoning with its anti-Black sentiments, its anti-Black culture, its anti-Black tradition, and also needs to start confronting and interrogating its misogyny and its objectification of its own women. What we see from this research institute called Stop AAPI Hate is this. There has been a like 3,000% increase in crimes and violence against the Asian community. And 70% of that increase is against Asian women. That tells us everything we need to know, that the misogyny of the Asian community and the misogyny of the white community are compounded upon the bodies and the existence of our Asian women. And to turn away is to participate in that violence. And so I say all of this, and I already know that there are some white people who I'm friends with who watch this podcast who will say, man, Tony, like, God doesn't see race, and this isn't a race thing, and you need to focus on the thing. And what I wouldn't give to just focus on the thing for the racism and the violence to stop. What I wouldn't give to just focus on the thing and have all of this oppression and murdering stop. What I wouldn't give. But what I have to give is to call it for what it is. And until it stops and I no longer have to call it for what it is, I'm going to keep at this. Not because I want to there's nothing fun about calling out white supremacy. There's nothing fun about having white people offended when you say what you say. Like, this isn't fun. I have no joy about this. You think I'm building some sort of platform? Like, no, there is no popularity and platform and book deals from this. There's only tremendous grief and angst. and so so all of that, what I find tremendously life-giving is being able to know that I have you, Matt, and you, Phil, on a weekly basis to say we are in this work together, and we come to this week in and week out, and this is a small contribution to the collective work that's already being done. That we're not trying to compete, but this is a communal contribution in whatever small way. And so that's where I'm working on okay, where do we begin? How do we start? It starts with conversations, sure, but then it starts with naming and calling out the very ills that infect and ail our society.
Yeah, a couple things, man. Thanks for sharing all that, man. Couple things. So, Matt, when I first heard this happened on Tuesday, I assumed it was a white man was the shooter. without question. That was, yeah, and I had no problems feeling, if you told me it was any other race of the person, I would have been shocked. Um, but the question that I have to both of you guys is, how much blame, and Tony, you expressed a little bit of this at the front of what you shared, but how much blame do we put on the church
Mm.
coming into situations like this, where we have that hope, expectation that, yo, this is not what it's always been, but then when it is what it's always been, we try to explain it as something else. um yeah, how much blame do you put on the church in the midst of things like this?
Yeah, and I don't like to be, I think people that get around me sometimes say, dude, is the church do anything good? And because I put significant blame on the church. I mean, I think it was just this last week, or wasn't it that Beth Moore stepped away from the Southern Baptist? So, I mean, people are, and she's not the first leader to do this. It's a continual, and as Tony, you were saying, I mean, I don't know how you can't blame the church when it's not like I can go on a hand and just say, oh, it's only on one hand the amount of leaders who have abused their power. That's not the case. I mean, I could give you a litany. I mean, I have friends who are just keeping track of all of the issues, the oppressiveness of these white male leaders. And if they're not white, like Robbie's not white, but he was in power. So I think, I mean, I don't, it might be way exaggerated, but I think what we see is the playing out of the absence of the church, because we have too many competing Christian narratives. Like Tony was talking about, we need communal contribution, not competition. But what we see within the denominations is pure competition. When you have a guy like Mark Driscoll, and I know people are like, oh my gosh, you shouldn't be calling out people. I think we need to start calling out the dudes like Driscoll, like Metaxas, like these guys, even Franklin Graham, because how can we get to the truth, the core essence of who Jesus is, if the person that is being presented is not the Jesus of the Gospels? And unfortunately, a lot of these dudes that are up front, it's just, we in general talk about, and going back to your point though, Tony, this is where I think the church is absent, is because when you talk about Asian and massage or any kind of parlor, it's automatically assumed. So just as much as Phil, I think you're right. We can probably, and to me, it's sad, but when you hear of a mass shooting, I don't think it's surprising when someone hears between 18 and 25, white dude. Okay. Which to me says, okay, are we going to address that? What's the deal with this angry, if this group of dudes supposedly have a society where they're able to have privilege, which I believe, I'm not denying white privilege at all. But what is the case with that? Like, I don't want to forget those dudes either. They're just as but they need to be understood as they are the victimizers. In thinking of their mental health and the situation with this 21-year-old, there needs to be Jesus in that mix, right? But there also needs to be a recognition Jesus would step in and not just embrace him and say, oh, you know what, let's deal with the sexual sin and not worry about this sin against humanity. Okay. So I think it's such a deep question that you're raising, Phil, because I think the absence of the church is presenting itself on a multitude of levels here, where our lack of care for one another is blowing up right here in our faces. And what are we doing? For us, the three of us, we get together and we laugh, and maybe, I don't know, maybe we don't see it that significant, but some people watch and go, holy crap, there's three dudes getting on there. They're not from the same backgrounds, and they're all talking about this same Jesus, and they're talking about ministry and doing things together, and they're agreeing on social issues. For a lot of people to be like, how do they do this? Like, what's the deal that those three guys, because they come from different backgrounds, and what we're being told in society is we shouldn't get along, nor should we see eye to eye because we have different background narratives. And yet the breaking in of Jesus does change, New Wine's about education, consultation, and transformation. So there's a transformation. So I think when we have to, even you having to ask that question, Phil, the church's role to me says there's a lack of the church. That's, I don't know, Tony, if you think.
Yeah, I think I think once again they're competing and contending Christianities. I don't think it's the same Christianity. And so therefore I think the church is at fault, but it's a particular church or a particular expression of the church. I mean, it used to be blood and soil, but now it's God and guns. I think we can very clearly tell which type of church promotes what. I think the church is to blame, but a particular church, if not a particular expression of the church.
Yeah, and I think of all that too, in particular the last thing you said, Tony, where there are, like Matt said, three of us here, we're part of different churches, we're part of different traditions coming up, and we still see the stream of the gospel where it's bringing people together, where it's incarnational, where it's, all the things. Incarnational is a buzzword that everyone uses now. We used it 20 years ago at New Wine, another issue, another day. So, but we're all here understanding the gospel in this particular way, and it's obvious that there's another way of understanding the gospel. There's another way of church life that is foreign to the things. I want to say foreign to the things that we understand, but at the same token, very much kind of what we're doing now is responding to them. Many of us, we can look back at our histories. I mean, coming up in the African-American church because of white supremacy is the existence of the African-American church. So there's so many things where our history has been bound to our faith and we see Jesus in this way, but man, there's been a long history of oppression being linked to Christianity, and that's a long time theme as far as long as the history of this country that we're living in currently. That there's something that really does need to be addressed, and that people need to speak straight out on and call things as they see them. And it's not people of color are the people that need to call things as they see them. I mean, when we see leadership being abused, when it's seen that leadership is being abused, it's going to have to be called out. I mean, these are things that we're going to have to be doing going forward. And I think, and I want to believe that in light of the summer that we've had, it's something that will happen. It's just kind of the next steps of how we deal with it, because I don't know if we know how to operate as a church without these oppressive streams of Christianity that's been a part of it. And it's difficult because, say they're a different strand, they're still our brother in Christ. They're still our sister in Christ that believes and holds these things. And it's crazy. It's crazy to kind of accept that and try to figure out how to live in the midst of all that. So,
Phil, that's where you're gracious, because I don't think they're our brothers and sisters in Christ. I think it's a wholly other God, wholly other Jesus. And that's why it's a contending Christianity. I think a Christianity that has no problem with slavery, but in fact endorses slavery and then endorses segregation, is actually a wholly other faith. And so I know I'm going to draw a lot of heat and flack for that, but I think it's difficult for us to maintain a John type of unity where Jesus says, I desire that you and I are one in the same way that the Father and I are one. I think
that's a good point, Tony, because it's like the question is could you have two theoretical Christianities competing, where one says January 6th was the protection of our foundation because we are a nation under God, whereas the other Christianity says no, the January 6th was an insurrectionist movement that was going against the fundamentals of Roman 13, because I agree with you. Isn't that the tension that we live in? If you like Phil, he's just super gracious. Like, I think of the three of us, he'd be the one who would embrace of the three of us. If a guy came up and smacked each one of us in the face, dudes, Phil would be the one to turn around and say, hey brother, here's my other cheek. I mean, he's just so I agree with you, Tony, that there's a part of it where not to be super judgmental, and yet there still needs to be judgment. Isn't there a judgment when I'm looking to the right and to the left at the stop sign? I'm making a judgment and everyone's okay with that judgment, right? And so I wonder if the church, part of the church's problem is that we're not willing to step into that. And I'm not saying that you're not stepping into it, Phil. I think I need you just as much as I need Tony to say, hey, are we ready to call this non-Christianity, right? Because I can point to, see, I think the problem is within the especially the Baptist tradition, but within the religious culture of the white person, is that there's an unwillingness to call out this for what it is, right? It's more of a hey, let's all be unified, which means let's all be, homogenous, one voice, right? Well, again, who's behind that voice? So I appreciate what you're saying, Phil, but do you think there comes a time though where we, like the three of us, would have to stand up and say, no, what that's doing, and if anyone supports like this as a Christian movement that would say that this 21-year-old had nothing to do with race, where the three of us would say, no, we have to stop and call that's not Christianity. Yes, let's love the dude by ministering to him, but he still is racist. Yes, he's a sex addict, but there still is racism here. It's a dehumanizing. I don't care if there was no justification for going in there, regardless of what they did for profession or who they were as people. I don't care if he's the biggest sex addict. How does that justify going in? You know what I'm saying? And so it's like, I agree with you, both of you.
Yeah. Definitely. There's not a space where there's never a space where I'm about dividing the church more. I'm going to be straight up with that. There's a space where we need to talk about things. There's a space where we need to not ignore things and call them as we see them. There's evils in every branch of the church. There's longtime evils amongst our white brothers and sisters within Christianity. I'm never going to be about dividing the church even further. There's more conversations need to be had. And just looking at our New Testament, we see very, very diverse streams of Christianity within our New Testament that we look at. Like I said, I wouldn't necessarily call any act that anyone does, someone who claims the name of Christ, I wouldn't call that person a non-Christian if they claim the name of Christ. That's a decision, not really a decision, but that's what's the word? That's a weeding out that God will do. Mm-hmm. Their faithfulness may tell them out, and I may not try to associate with them. But at the same token, that's my brother and sister in Christ that I love, and I'm gonna pray for. So yeah.
And I totally appreciate you for saying that, Phil, because for me, I would say I don't see it as division because there's no fellowship to begin with to divide. And while I agree with you that in the early church there was a diversity of positions, I don't see anywhere in the early church where it was, hey, you can oppress and abuse and rape and domesticate and the like a particular people group and still be a Christian. Mm-hmm. And so that's where I would have a hard time. And I wonder if I think it's hard for us to be peacemakers when we don't interrogate and confront the violence. And so it's along the same lines of like when a white person says like, I'm not racist. And it's like, man, you're more concerned about not being called racist than whether or not if you're participating in racism. And so in the same vein, it's like, I'm not out here trying to split hairs and be the one that separates the goats from the sheep. But I think this is why young people keep saying the church is hypocritical or the church fails its witness, because the church would far rather say, oh no, we're all Christians, we're all brothers and sisters, rather than saying, I think more people just need to frankly step up and say, okay, like they claim Jesus, but that's not who Jesus is. Like Christians, quote unquote, have no problem saying Mormons and Jehovah's Witnesses and the like aren't Christians. But then when it's like somebody who has closer affinity, like that's the problem with theology. Like we have the same language, but we're saying two different things. And so I hear your heart, Phil. I'm all about maintaining unity. But I'm not about sacrificing the women and the elderly to continue to maintain unity. And I'm not saying that's what you're doing, Phil. I'm saying that's what other people are doing, and I'm not about that game.
All right, wait, let me also go here though. Very. This is gonna be heavy. I'm just gonna say it.
No,
Right,
let's do it.
right. Where do we get our education from? Where do we get our theological education from? Who funds that? Yeah, a lot of those forces that oppress and support those things, or I don't even want to say they support, but at least ignore those areas of oppression today. And I meet some of those people, and in some regard, see, I could have brought it closer, but I'm not going to. But I've been around some of those people, and yeah, they're good people. And you know what?
But they're goofy. But they're goofy, Phil. They're goofy.
Yes, I'm not disagreeing with that at all. But the reality of that conversation where, yeah, there's just some people that are just blind to some of this stuff. And it really just is a trick of the enemy that they're blind by it. And you see it, and it's frustrating, and it's harmful, and it kills people. And the like. But at the same token, I just know that Satan's about dividing us as a church. And I want to go to the streams of us. Now, I'm going to say some hard things. I'm going to say some challenging things. And I'm going to call people out. And I'm not going to call too many people out right here. But it's a conversation that when I keep saying conversation, there needs to be some finger pointing like, yo, you can't keep seeing this and then call it not what it is. So there is that. But it's just that it's so ingrained in how we do church. Living in Portland, where the Black community is so small, the Black church is a very small, minute in relationship to the larger churches that's here, but at one point was very powerful in the area, in the neighborhood that I currently live in. And just think, well, what happened there? Was that, these are things that I'm processing and thinking, and think that, could our church, could Black churches be in existence without some of these forces that's out and about? I don't know. So it's a thought, it's things that I'm having, but at the same token, man, we all come through this grace door one way, and we're all covered with sin as we walk through it, and our sin plays out in so many different ways that I'm not to the point where I'm like, that isn't Christian, but that doesn't look like Jesus, and I'm gonna say, that out loud. So
yeah, and I think that's the thing, right? We're all on different spectrums. I am probably, closer towards Tony when, I think, Phil but that's why we need one another, right? We need each other to continue to push, but then also as one of us is a little bit further out pushing, the other one can be pulling back and saying, hey, got it. This is great, because all of this is necessary. We need this dialogue. But if it's yelling at the other, isn't that just as violent as what we're claiming that, shouldn't be done? And so we're going to continue this. Last week, again, we talked about this building, bridges or chaos. This week, we were talking about, again, this stepping out of the box and getting into embracing and living with each other. Next week, we want to continue this conversation and talking about these competing Christianities. How can that be? The reality of a competition between narratives about, well, what Christian line, what Christianity, and are there a multitude of Christian narratives that are competing? And so we're going to continue this because we all want unity. John 17 is a truth that it needs to continue to embrace the church. Question is how do we move into that without dehumanizing one another, because the last thing I need is for you, Tony, or you, Phil, to blend into someone more looking like me. And the same thing is, you don't need me to blend into someone looking like you. We need to be distinct and inseparably linked, right? Again, we need our distinctions, because who you are is a beautiful thing just as much as who I am is beautiful, and it draws into the core, into the complexity of the human. But we need to be honest and authentic. And so next week, as we continue this, we're going to continue this conversation of the competing Christianities. What's the true narrative? Is there one narrative in there? So again, on behalf of Tony and Phil, I'm Matt. This has been New Wine Uncorked, and we've appreciated you being here with us. Till next week, we'll see you on the flip side.